Hello, this is Kate Bartlett from MLA 6000, Dr. Reno's Spring 2016 Research and Writing class. And this is my presentation on the emergence of literary modernism and the role of women in interwar Britain. So in order to really get a grasp and understand why modernism as a movement came about and the spark of culture change happened, we must first really look at World War I and the impact it had on all these different aspects of British culture. Because Great Britain had a very long history in warfare, and this was certainly not the first major role or major war that the nation had faced, it's really important to note that World War I in particular, because of the times, as the 19 teens, there were technological advances, was super significant because of the type of warfare that was experienced. This war in particular was extremely gruesome and left an extremely lasting mark on the nation. Hundreds of thousands of men died in battle. Over a million were killed on both sides. And this was very significant and had a lasting impact in viewpoints of nationalism as well as politics. It ended up bleeding over into gender roles and class and economics, and so it was an extremely significant war that we'll explore further. What's unique about World War I is that it was believed to be a pretty short war, short and contained conflict. There's a lot of optimism. Lots of people thought when Britain entered the war that the boys would be home by Christmas. They'd be home in just a few months. Allied powers were very strong. There was a lot of optimism with the strength of the armies. However, as the months and months dragged on and turned into years, this war, especially coupled with the high number of casualties and the really gruesome and horrific ways that people were killed, ended up changing ultimately the entire perspective of warfare as well as nationalism. The idea of fighting for king and country and a blind sense of nationalism that whatever the country decides or whatever the leaders decide is right ended up really shifting. World War I is referred to as the war to end all wars, which ironically, only a few years later, World War II broke out. So clearly, this was certainly not the war to end all wars. And the thought at the time was that because this was imagined to be a short and contained conflict, that there was a lot of support from home. People had faith in the war efforts, and this was a unique war. Even after one of the most significant battles, the Battle of Somme, where over 800,000 British men were killed, that's over a 4-month battle. It was expected to be a really brief victory for the Allied forces, ended up dragging on for 4 months. And even after, in a single day, when 20,000 British soldiers were killed, and many of them recent recruits who had just joined the forces, the support for the war and the idea that this was a necessary battle really still didn't waver on a large scale. However, though the majority of British citizens clung to their patriotic ideals, wartime ended up really taking its toll on those at the home front. A severe labor shortage emerged as all of these hundreds and thousands of men left the workforce to enlist in the military. That left a huge void in those jobs and their roles at work. Because of that, women found a new role in the workforce, and their role as part of British society had an opportunity to make their mark and really change the role of women in Western culture for forever. Employment and marketing campaigns were launched specifically for women to support their husbands, fathers, brothers, sons to enlist. Women in Britain say go, don't hold back your men. And then women come into the factories, come into work, do your part. Even those who stayed at home or kept their traditional roles had a part in supporting the war effort, not only in their thoughts and in their support in writing letters, but in rations and in doing their part to support the war effort from home. Many women served in more traditional roles as nurses and healthcare workers. However, the majority of the jobs available were primarily held by men, and over 1.6 million women ended up filling the roles and taking on the jobs that were previously held by the men. In transportation, factories, mills, women were really picking up the slack to keep Britain running, and not only just as a nation, but as a nation at war. A unique group of women who worked in the ammunition factories. This ended up being a very dangerous job. Uh, this particular group of women were called the munitionettes, coined as those who worked in these factories, and exposure to chemicals, high risk of explosion. It was extremely volatile in environment. However, these women served and were called to this position. Even though this was a very dangerous and scary type of job, and they were making far less money than their male counterparts, this type of service in the workforce really set the gears moving for women as being considered as legitimate workers, as competent in the workforce, as a contributing member to the employment field. And so, in a lot of ways, this opportunity to serve in the workforce really sparked a lot of what would later become huge movements in suffrage and the changing culture in the role of women. By the end of the war, over 3.2 million women were employed in industry jobs. And because of these roles, suffrage really kicked in. A quote from David Lloyd George, who was the prime minister at the time, said, "It would have been utterly impossible for us to have waged a successful war had it not been for the skill and ardor, enthusiasm, and industry in which these women in this country have thrown into the war." So a great appreciation for women really sparked from this. Again, even though they were not making the same wages and the work environment was at times very dangerous, there was still a great sense of respect and appreciation for the role of these women during that time. The Representation of the People's Bill passed in 1917, just months before the end of the war. This granted voting rights to almost 9 million British women. This was very important legislation because it was before the end of the war and armistice. So this was definitely in motion, and things were happening not only after the war, but during the war while men were still away. This particular bill, the Representation of the People Act, did not grant voting rights to all women. It was very specific. It was granted only to those women who were over 30 years old, who owned a home, or the wives of someone who owned a home. If they owned property, earned a certain amount of money, had a college education, etc. So this was kind of a start, however, to increasing the voting rights and rights for all women. And that would not be granted until years later. However, this role in suffrage played a huge impact in the culture shift in Great Britain and in the West as a whole. With women in their newfound role in the workforce and with the new vote, position in society, this really was starting to change culture and viewpoints. As the public witnessed men coming, those men returning with their own stories, a huge increase in expression started to happen. Many soldiers returned home to tell their story, write memoirs, publish stories and poems. Some of the most famous war poets wrote during the war and during the conflict. However, many, when they returned home, faced horrifying results of physical damage, including loss of limbs, loss of sight, physical scars, as well as emotional scars. And this is where we saw a lot of effects of shell shock, which we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But this was a huge impact on those returning home. These particular war poets hugely defined literature during World War I. There were some poets that really idolized and glorified war with a sense of honor, glory, patriotism. That was oftentimes what we think of as, oh, this is the soldier's poem. However, World War I was one of the first times we saw more of a realistic viewpoint of war. Several war poets, like the ones listed here, wrote about the horrors of war, death and destruction. Many of them had sentiments of anger, confusion, were questioning the purpose of the war, were questioning their leaders and those who had brought them there. These kind of sentiments really were played out in their poems. Wilfred Owen, who's one of the most famous war poets, wrote a short poem titled "It is Sweet and Honorable to Die for One's Country," which within the poem you would think this is a proclamation of honor and patriotism. However, it was gruesome details and very scary description of the realities of war. And so this idea that we fight for our country and we trust all of the ideals really began to be questioned. And so because not necessarily an anti-war genre, but a questionable war genre really emerged. And this came and was dominated mostly from those soldiers who experienced the war first. However, because of the effects of this and those noticing the effects of the war and the kind of perspective shifts, modernism as a movement kind of found its window of opportunity. With roots in different movements, specifically with artistic and literary movements that preceded World War I, modernism was started out as kind of a smaller, not as mainstream type of movement. However, after the war and during this interwar period between World War I and World War II, modernism found its window of opportunity. Modernism is a stark contrast to the Victorian era and Romantic ideals, whereas Victorian times were a time of stability and tradition and deep roots in gender roles and the roles of different classes and members of society. after the war, these new ideas of kind of moving away from tradition, moving away from that sense of the old times, a rejection of those ideals really came about. Of course, with the change in gender roles with women in the workforce, this was a huge player in the roles of those in society as far as classism, as well as women and feminism started to really take shape. Also, a sense of cynicism and questioning political figures, and rather than blindly accepting what leaders say, a questioning of the role of those leaders in leading the country, and then also mistrust in establishment. And then with all of this, less trust in traditional roles as far as religion and faith starting to waver, and more of a focus on secularism. Secularism. The movement spread and was really rooted in the sciences like psychology and philosophy, as well as in the arts, so literature, particularly fiction, music, and classic arts as well. So many famous players during this time, in that interwar time, are considered modernists. Modernist movement produced some very significant literature, and some characteristics of this type of literature are listed here. The thought of stream of consciousness, which is a very fluid, moving from one thought to the other, not a sense of a concrete plot. Many of this fiction had no plot whatsoever. It was very fragmented and a non-linear type of expression. There's no traditional character development, setting, plot sequence, etc. Also, this movement dealt with a lot of non-traditional content, some somewhat taboo themes, including women and the role of women in gender, sexuality, lots of avant-garde type of themes here. And so this type of literature was really embraced on a larger scale. Even though it started out as a very small, somewhat underground type movement, it really grew into a much more mainstream type of thinking. This also questioned a lot of the conservative ideals of literature prior, including religion, politics, philosophy, and overall culture. And so this modernist movement ended up really taking shape and growing as the interwar time progressed and moved forward. As many women were finding their new roles and finding their place in this interwar time, the same was was true for women writers. Virginia Woolf is a huge player in this interwar period in modernist literature. She was born in Great Britain, or born in England. Catherine Mansfield was born in New Zealand, however, spent most of her life in England. And these are two big players in the modernist movement. Virginia Woolf, in particular, wrote specifically about the war. Her novel Jacob's Room was extremely significant in the portrayal of the effects of the war to those at home, as well as Mrs. Dalloway, which deals with particular characters who've returned from the war experiencing shell shock, those who have family who had served in the war, and the effects of those at home. This is kind of a different spin, especially with those who are coming home writing these memoirs and stories from their experience on the battlefield. This was an experience or an opportunity for women to write about their experiences and to really tap into how the war has affected them as women and members of society. This newfound voice really gave women the opportunity as well to explore more of a feminist ideal, clashing with tradition, especially in the sense of marriage, motherhood, society life. These were things that were really portrayed in novels by both Woolf and Mansfield. With war as a backdrop to all of these movements in science, in art, literature, as well as these changing viewpoints of culture and gender roles, World War I had a truly lasting impact on Britain and the entire West. Really, the experiences from the soldiers abroad, as well as the impact of those at home, became really defining for changes in all of these things, including women's rights, political viewpoints, impact of societal norms, and culture as a whole. It also really redefined the sense of nationalism and patriotism, particularly when it came to warfare. And a lot of these changes were very obvious when wars of more modern times followed, like World War II, especially as means of expression became more accessible. Um, Printing and publishing was more accessible. Women began to find their opportunity to provide a kind of counter image of what had been traditionally expressed in the past. Their creativity became more widely accepted, and the writing that emerged from this time and the embrace of individualism became regarded as some of the most important of the entire 20th century. And so the impacts of World War I and the impacts of modernism as a movement are very lasting.